This is the Mormon Mixed Faith Marriage Podcast with certified life coach Brooke Booth, episode number 106. I'm going to take another dive into communication in this episode. Communication is, I kind of consider it like a big, hairy, huge skill set. Like it's layered, and there are different types of skills and many of them. And you might be good at some and not so good at others. And there's no doubt yet another one to learn and master and incorporate in your marriage. So whenever I hear a podcast on communication or a blog post on communication or a speaker on communication, I always pay attention because there's always something to learn around communication. What I wanted to talk about in this podcast is I wanted to go over some four, I'll call them pillars just for a fun, catchy phrase, 4 pillars of communication. Now, again, there are a lot more things than just these 4 pillars to have really good communication, but these are really 4 great ones to start with. These are 4 great ones that even if you've already started to master and to really get good at. If you're overwhelmed by the communication things, start with these 4. And with these 4, this is a great place to start and practice and master with communication. Okay, let me tell you where I got these 4. I was talking to a client and she'd mentioned these 4 that I don't even know she'd heard somewhere else. And I teach these 4 regularly. I just never taught them as a cluster of 4 communication skills. And I kind of like it. So I'm going to teach it that way here. I'm going to teach you these 4 communication pillars. I'm going to talk through them and how they can apply to a mixed faith marriage. So I've talked about this stuff before, but I want to talk about it again. You can't hear this stuff too much. And it's always time for a refresher or a tune-up. Okay, these are the 4 communication pillars. Know your preferences, communicate your desires, clarify expectations, and repair. Let's go through these one by one. And I will say, I believe these to be building on each other. And I believe the first one to be the most important. And until you get the first one dialed in, figured out, you're not going to be able to successfully move to 2, 3, and 4. Okay, know your preferences. This is one I'll teach forever and a day. I will come back to this one time and time and time again. Know your preferences. Often we don't give ourselves permission to really explore our own preferences. We think this makes us selfish or mean or unkind. So we don't value knowing our own preferences. Maybe you think that you can't have them anyway, so why shine a light on there? That's too painful. You'll be too disappointed. What I want to make a case for is that knowing your preferences is critical in being able to communicate effectively. Knowing your preferences means you can be a partner and an equal, because knowing your preferences means you're actually putting your preferences on the table so they can be considered. A lot of times the work I do with clients, they feel stuck. They don't feel like a partner. They don't feel chosen. They don't feel a priority. And when we start looking, a lot of times it's just this. They're not actually knowing their preferences to even be able to put them on the table to be considered in their marriage. And so they don't feel important. They don't feel chosen. They don't feel prioritized. And it isn't because their spouse doesn't love them. That might be the case in certain instances, but it's rare. 9 times out of 10, it's because they think it's too selfish to even know their preferences to be able to put them on the table. So if you feel like your preferences are not considered in your marriage, this is the step I really want you to focus on. This is where I want you to start the exploration. Do you know them to even share them? Again, those of us who are socialized as female are taught to put other people's preferences first. So why even look at what they are? Because they don't matter as much as other people. So then naturally we don't communicate them. And that can definitely lead to resentment. I have certainly done that. So pay attention to your ability to even know your preferences. What's stopping you from knowing your preferences? And do you need to clean that up first so you can really start to access and know your preferences? Here's an exercise for you to start to know your preferences is write them down without any filter. See what comes up. Do they seem outrageous, too much, too greedy? Does it make you uncomfortable to even do this exercise? Maybe you're filtering yourself or downplaying your preferences as you write. This is going to help you to start to know what's stopping you from knowing your preferences. Now, note what this step is. It's know your preference. We haven't even got to sharing them yet. This is just the first critical step. So you need to know them before you can even share them. You can't do the rest of these steps, like I was saying earlier, without doing this one first. This is the linchpin, if you will. Without this one, there's nothing to communicate. There's nothing to clarify on. There's nothing to repair. A lot of times without really doing the work around this one, we are in, like, it's not on purpose. It's on accident, but we are effectively just opening the door to a room full of resentment and feeling stalked and ignored and invisible. Know your preferences. So how this might apply to a mixed faith marriage. Start writing out your preferences around your mixed faith marriage. What are your preferences around Sundays? Coffee, clothing, garments, youth activities, family reunions. Write out and get honest with yourself about what your preferences are in the certain areas that specifically impact a mixed faith marriage. Okay, let's look at step number 2, communicate desires. So this is just a fancy way for saying share your preferences, right? So know your preferences, share your preferences. And again, I'd get really curious here. What comes up here when you think about sharing the preferences you wrote? Again, it could sound like I'm asking too much. I can't have it anyway. I should be content with what I have. I don't deserve that. I already asked for too much. He or she's not going to be interested. Notice what comes up. These are the very things stopping you from communicating your desires, from sharing your preferences. These are the very thoughts that are stopping you, blocking you from partnership and from better communication and more open communication. I'd get very, very curious if you know your preferences, why you're not sharing them. If I like to think about this isn't an analogy I use with my clients. If you're running track and the hurdles, like these thoughts, like they don't care, I'm asking too much, I can't have it anyway. These are the hurdles. We want to remove the hurdles out of the way so you can run freely down the track without the hurdles being in the way. So get really clear about what's stopping you from sharing your preferences. Address that, and then it'll be so much easier to share your preferences. When we're able to share our preferences, it's opening the door to important things like partnership, opening the door to important things like honoring both people's in the relationship, respecting both people in the relationship. Ironically enough, when we withhold our preferences, we're not creating any sort of opportunity for our spouse to hear us and know us, honor us, and respect us in that way. So a lot of times we feel a lack of those things. So here's a mixed faith marriage application. Can you tell your spouse your preferences around the topics you wrote about? Maybe it was coffee or shopping on Sunday. And if you're really struggling here, this is definitely an area I'd get some coaching on. What's making it hard to talk about? Sometimes I'll do this work and I'll write it out and I'll be ready. And it'll just catch in my throat. I won't be able to vocalize it. And oftentimes that's some sort of belief hanging out there that you're selfish or you're asking too much or you should just be okay without this. Silly stuff like this, but nonetheless, those are the very little things stop us from connecting, because that's what communication primarily is about, and that stop us from being a partnership Because a lot of times it's this type of communication that really facilitates a partnership. Okay, let's talk about clarify expectations. This is a more advanced communication skill, in my opinion. Here you're making sure you understand your spouse's desires and preferences. Here you're also clarifying terms, phrases, words. You really drill into what is being said and what's being put on the table so that you both understand. When I was a commercial litigator, I would oftentimes have to do litigation around contracts. Like, that was extremely typical. Dense, thick, complicated commercial contracts. Maybe it's a merger and acquisition. Maybe it's some sort of shareholder agreement. These really thick contracts. And the place I went to start wrapping my head around what I was dealing with first was the definition section of the contract. I love this section. This is where the attorneys who drafted the agreement, we called them transactional attorneys, this is where they would say, okay, in this agreement, this term is going to mean this. So shareholder is going to mean this. Merger is going to mean this. Acquisition is going to mean this. And then they would specifically provide a definition. So when they use that term later on in the agreement, in the contract, I would know exactly what they were talking about. Because if you notice, a lot of times words we use, especially in our relationships, definitely in legal contracts, can have multiple meanings. Different people make different words mean different things. So when I'm talking about clarifying expectations, like one aspect of this work to be aware of is, are you and your spouse using the same definition for the same words? Is this something my husband and I are constantly doing work around? We use the same words, and so we're like, great, we agree. We're saying the same thing, but we have very different definitions. Or we might be using different words, but actually having a very similar definition. This is an important part of clarifying expectations. This takes time. It takes time to realize where expectations are not clear, and then takes time to clarify them. Here's an example that might crop up in a mixed faith marriage. Let's say the expectation is no coffee in the house. But does that mean I just don't make coffee in the house, but I can bring an empty coffee cup in from Starbucks to throw away in the kitchen garbage? Or does that mean my kids don't see coffee cups in the car? What does that mean? A lot of times we think it's so obvious. And it might be to ourselves, but clarifying expectations, important skill, a very important skill. Take the time to never assume that you're thinking, like, what you think it means is the same thing that they think it means. Another great example is tithing. I mean, this is even into a same faith marriage, let alone a mixed faith marriage, but definitely in a mixed faith marriage. What does 10% mean? Pre-tax, post-tax, like, so many different ways you can interpret 10%. Maybe the agreement is our kids go to youth activities. What does that mean? What are the expectations? Youth conference, seminary, mutual nights, girls camp, trek, EFY, which I know they have a different name now for Strength of Youth Camp, I think. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. Like, what do we mean by we expect our kids to attend youth activities? All of them, most of them, 80% of the time? What does it mean? Important skill, clarifying expectations. A lot of times clarifying expectations isn't always just like, do we define the words the same way, even though that's a helpful place to start. Another form of clarifying expectations is, I consider it like the ongoing conversation we have around an issue. Say you two are talking through something important, like the kids and their attendance. I want you to consider clarifying expectations. Another way of saying it is, this is one in a series of conversations. This is 1 in 10 conversations you're going to need to have on this topic as things change, as questions arise, as things need to be clarified, as exceptions need to be considered, as a situation came up that wasn't foreseen. This is clarifying expectations. Okay, repair. I'm a big, big fan of repair work. Big fan. They help keep us real because we're never going to be perfect all of the time. We're never going to always be full of kindness and goodness all of the time. Repair work, I think, just speaks to the humanity in us. I heard one thing a couple years ago, and I think it's just so important. Repair work is just as valuable as doing it right in the first place. I tell this to myself regularly with my parenting and in my own marriage. Repair work is just as valuable as doing it right in the first place because it shows, one, that we're taking responsibility for what's going on. It shows our humility. It shows our investment in the relationship, that we're willing to acknowledge and then come in and follow up and clean up and repair as best we can. I'm gonna say it again, repair work is just as valuable as doing it right in the first place. Now, repair work can look like a lot of different things. Apologizing is a classic repair work. Own your nonsense. I messed up. I was sloppy. I was wrong. Learn how to apologize and apologize well. It's a skill. Now, this is my own pet peeve. I know this isn't for everybody, but this is my podcast, so I'm going to say it. Please avoid, I'm sorry you feel that way. Now, this may work with some people, but this is one I just want to just think a little bit more about. I'm sorry you feel this way. And again, this is my own take. Maybe you don't have this problem, but it feels a little judgy to me. It feels a little bit like, I didn't do anything wrong, so I'm sorry you feel this way. To me, that doesn't feel like an apology. It feels more like a little bit like an attack. If you mean it from a good place, then you just might want to consider slightly different words. I never meant to cause you suffering. I am so sorry I caused you suffering is just as true instead of I'm sorry you feel that way. So why not just say that? This is a little bit where we get into intention versus impact, which we could have a whole nother podcast on, and maybe I should. My intention was good, even though my execution was bad. Still, your execution was bad. This is, I think, the inherent meaning behind I'm sorry you feel that way. It's okay to say, my execution was bad, and to own that. That's what I'm suggesting here, is just to own that, because guess what? Your spouse, the reason you're apologizing is because they're in pain. It's because they're hurting. And a lot of times we're so busy reacting to our own shame and our own guilt that we forget to actually address the pain in front of us. So try, I'm sorry, I screwed up. I did that poorly. I said that unkindly. My execution was bad. Instead of I'm sorry you feel that way. Okay, four pillars of communication. Let me repeat them. We have one, know your preferences. I consider this the foundation. Do a lot of your work here. Share your preferences. Now, these two can be interesting. What's stopping you from doing that? Lots of work can be done just with that question. What's stopping you from either knowing or sharing your preferences? Step two is communicate your desires or share your preferences. Step 3 is clarify your expectations. And step 4 is repair work. You most likely have all 4 of these skills to varying degrees already. Consider that. Maybe you're not very good at some of them. Maybe the way you communicate your desire is sarcastically or snarkily or through passive aggression. But you're still communicating your desires, which means you know your desires. That's good. That's a good thing. a lot of times, the reason I'm saying this is a lot of times when we learn skills or we review skills, we use it as an excuse to beat ourselves up, to find ourselves lacking, to shame ourselves into better behavior. I don't want you to do that. Please don't use these tools as an excuse to beat yourself up. Use these tools as a way to get curious about you, why you're doing certain things, to refine from a place of gentleness with yourself and not to refine from a place of shame with yourself. So much of communication is just refining. Refine from a place of love and gentleness and curiosity, not from guilt and shame and disgust at yourself. Celebrate where you are on your journey to developing better communication. Celebrate how far you've come. Celebrate what you're learning and what you're doing and what you're trying, because it's important. It's a big deal. So often, if you're anything like me, you spend a lot of time looking at what you've not yet perfected and not yet mastered. And we forget to look at how far we've come and what we have accomplished and the improvements and the skills we have developed. So as you listen to these 4 things, please don't now berate yourself for not being really great at clarifying expectations or forgetting to do some repair work. Please don't do that. Just use this as a way to gently remind yourself and to be kind and generous with yourself while also doing that refining work on your communication skills to help your mixed faith marriage. Okay, keep refining, keep dialing in. If you need more help, as always, reach out to brookeboothcoaching.com. You can schedule a call to talk to me if you think coaching is something that can help you develop the skills and tools you need to have a very successful Mormon mixed faith marriage. All right, wishing you the best.